Hey everyone, fantastic episode today. We finally got our missing files back from Adobe and we interview Jonas from bonsaitonight.com. It's a fantastic chat with Jonas and we cover a broad range of topics that will be of great interest to everyone here in Aotearoa and further afield. Enjoy.
How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. How are you today?
Fantastic. What's the weather like where you are right now?
Oh, it's cool. Maybe a high of like 55 degrees today.
It's start of winter for you, is it?
Yeah, we don't really have seasons here, but what passes for winter has started to kick in.
Oh, wow. So that's the Bay Area. That's where you are, isn't it?
That's right. I'm just due east of San Francisco a few miles.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we are here in New Zealand, the bottom of the world, or the top, depending on which way you look at it. It is start of summer here and pretty hot and pretty dry.
Oh, already the heat, huh?
Yeah, very hot.
Today it's like 72 degrees with a cool breeze.
Oh, that's not too bad.
Yeah. Jonas, what growing zone are you in?
Oh, good question. They just recategorized it. I completely ignore zones because that only refers to the lows as opposed to the highs.
Right.
Is it 9? No, I'll have to look that up. I forget.
I thought you and I were both 10B.
Oh, that sounds right.
Because San Francisco and Wellington, the more I've looked into it, seem to have the pretty exact same weather.
That's right. Yeah, it's either 10A, 10B, probably 10B. We didn't even hit freezing last year, really.
And we didn't in Wellington in winter either.
Wow. Yeah, we haven't had summer or winter the last 3-4 years, and it's really shown in the garden.
In what aspects?
Yeah, a lot of the temperate species don't really kick into gear without heat in summer. And so I've actually started selling most of my Japanese and Trident maples, which is a heartbreak because they don't grow in summer without heat and they don't go super dormant in winter. So like I no longer have azaleas. I'm pretty much cutting down the maples and just fewer and fewer species want to be in this just year-round mild weather.
I have a Japanese large group that I've had for about 5 years that's moving along well, but I feel like it didn't really get its winter dormancy, and I'm losing the top in one of them, but the rest of it's pumping, and I just think it's because we don't get cold enough here in Wellington.
Yeah.
No surprise.
Yeah.
No surprise there at all. So, Jonas, what species are you having good success with as these seasons are blending into one?
Well, I've been doubling down on some natives, and so coast redwoods have been doing really well. So I'm starting to grow a lot more of those. The old standbys, black pine and juniper, red pine, those are all doing well. And then I'm doing more broadleaf, so some oaks, both the cork oak and the domestic California live oak, and olives. None of these grow quickly without the heat, at least not the olives and oaks, but they seem to get by without much heat.
Oh, interesting. That actually leads us well into our sort of initial questions we'd love to chat to you about. So, yeah, we were wondering, how would you describe designing with your own trees stylistically, especially given you've had to, the climate's changing, obviously. So you're moving towards those species you've just mentioned. This is obviously making you have to adapt design-wise, where you're going with your trees.
Well, it's interesting in that some species lend themselves to different techniques or different kinds of designs. And so I don't know that it's had an artistic impact beyond which species I'm working with, but I'm still trying to create the same kind of forms I was creating before.
And what would you say those forms are? Is that more
Well,
towards the traditional model or?
it's such a fun question. I was thinking, I love talking about this question. I don't know if I have a satisfying answer, so I'm happy to get started. My work does tend to be on the more conservative or traditional side, but I will say that I find, like so many artists, I like starting with the trunk and letting the trunk kind of determine the direction in terms of the weight, the balance, and just the basic kind of key concepts like branch angles or branch movement. I like to key all that from the trunk. And as I find myself working with really non-traditional material, which happens more and more these days, both in workshops and in my garden, I find myself really leaning on more contemporary or less traditional approaches.
Ah, interesting. Yeah. And would you say so moving from the trunk outwards, I mean, especially with the broadleaf scenarios, are you looking towards still building a traditional structure per se off that trunk line, but are you looking to add sort of that age to them once you've say gone 10 years out with some of these, say the broadleaf that you might be working on? Are you finding you're pulling some sections out to open it up and create more age in a broadleaf sense, which might be taking it away slightly from the it's a slightly more contemporary and slightly away from the traditional model? Do you find that happening after about 10 years?
Well, what's funny is just hearing you work through that question, you actually touched on pretty much every single aspect of the process that comes to bear on the resulting style of an approach to a given tree. So I can give you a
Mm,
couple examples that'll make it seem straightforward. When I think of how I would design a pine or a juniper, I think of the primary branch angles as descending below the horizontal,
yeah.
descending a little bit below on a pine, descending much steeper on a juniper. If someone brings me a tree in a workshop that has really funky, heavy branches that come out at all kinds of different angles, if they don't have the interest in cutting off all the branches or grafting the tree from scratch, I find myself having to lean on more contemporary approaches to take advantage of the branches that are there. So that's one aspect of it, is kind of how I'm designing that. You mentioned specifically broadleafs. And for broadleafs, I find a lot more flexibility in approach, whether we have more ascending branch angles or descending branch angles. Again, we can key from the trunk and go from there. And it's just been really interesting. The goal for me has always been the same, which is something else you touched on. How do you represent age or great age in these trees? And that's the thing I find the biggest or the greatest challenge when working with contemporary approaches, because by definition, these are techniques that haven't been employed for giant numbers of years like our more traditional models. And so, and it's funny, I wrote about this morning actually. If you're taking a naturalistic approach or contemporary approach, or call it what you will, I have the same question for all of these practitioners, which is how do you best represent age? And I know that's something that you all have likely dealt with, lacking decades and decades of depth on trees that have been developed, native trees in New Zealand.
That's right. Yeah.
I imagine you face a lot of those same kinds of options and challenges.
Yeah, we do. That's the reason why I wanted to chat to you about it, because looking at the states and where you guys, the US, where you guys are at, um, it's a few steps ahead of here in New Zealand or even Australia possibly. But even listening to your chat with Ryan the other day on his podcast, you keyed into a lot of issues that we are dealing with, um, from the artistic sense right through to the shows as well. Um,
Uh,
yeah, so it's quite interesting. I sort of struggle with that a little bit too, which I've been doing bonsai for around 30, coming up 30 years now.
mhm.
And as you develop a tree, especially if you started it from scratch or whether it be collected or not, um, you go through these cycles, building out the pads inevitably becomes quite full. I really enjoy taking out the apex and putting that ancient feel in, but inevitably the apex will reform and we try and keep it small or whatnot. Pads get heavier, so we're doing a lot of removal and rebuilding. which is the nature of the art form. But I saw that you had been recently to Walter Poole's garden,
Yeah.
and his stylistically, a lot of his trees have those spruces, those multiple apices that have been snapped out and replaced. That's very similar to a lot of our natives here in New Zealand, down here, our podocarps. So as he has inevitably removed some of those sections as the trees have gone by, I still think that it ends up following. It's not that, to me, it's not that contemporary what Walter is doing, because as things fill in, he has to remove those sections to create age again. In Japan, though, it seems that they wouldn't be as willing to remove some of those very defined apexes. What do you think about that?
So that's one of the conversations I kind of had in mind when I was going to Germany. I mean, that was kind of the whole point of the trip, was to, hey, I really want to see this garden and, get to know the people doing this work in this vein. And I had, man, so many thoughts came to mind. One is I think it was my end result for me at the garden is I feel like I finally have a good takeaway, not specifically on naturalistic bonsai as much as what the stylistic differences are from person to person. And here's my crazy idea. We'll see what you think of it.
Okay.
Is I found we're often all using the same trunks for bonsai, give or take. We're looking for trunks with age, character, and beauty, whatever the species is, whatever those words might mean for an individual with a given species. And then in terms of the branches, we need to get from that starting point of a trunk to create a silhouette. And there are essentially only so many models for that. Some are a little fuller, some are a little more open, but the size in general is relatively determined by the shape of the trunk. And so then we get to, what about the last mile, those last 2 to 4 inches at the tips of every branch? More and more, I'm starting to think that, with a small number of exceptions, that the main differences from artist to artist, or stylistic approach from stylistic approach, we're just treating that last mile differently. Are we making dense pads? Are we making high levels of twigginess with consistent internodes? Are we letting our trees grow in unmolested by wire or pruning, but then every few years we cut it all back and regrow it, in which case we have old trees with young growth tips? Are we stylizing that last mile with lots of wires so it all just looks fresh but dramatic? And so, without really addressing the naturalistic part, it's funny to me to think, well, wait a minute, that's how I can distinguish between this professional or that professional, or this country or that country.
Yeah. Good call. Agree with that.
The trees are always providing us with a lot of informative support of what we can do and what we can't do, and that process of elimination of just going like, the branch doesn't look better here or there. So it's always like, when we're getting aspects of age into it, it's giving us more insight to the design, and we may be limited in what we can do based on the trunk, but we have that informative support to create these designs.
Yeah, it's interesting to say strip it back to any given trunk line you're given, and framing that trunk line, as you're saying, Jonas, is framing that trunk line. The artist will decide how they're going to frame that trunk, and then you'd throw in how they're going to display it too, in terms of container or not container, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the artistic elements. If you stripped it all back, you've got a frame, which might be the trunk or the container. Yeah, so you have this frame, and then the artistic. Yeah, I mean, it sort of ties into my next question for you is, what do you want the viewer to take away from some of your favorite trees in your garden? What's the idea behind that?
Yeah, it's such a fun idea to think about that. I very much design my trees to be pleasing for me to look at, for me to enjoy. And so while I'm doing something essentially for the viewer, I guess it gets back to one of those key questions about why we do art. Are we doing it for ourselves? Are we doing it for an audience? And
Yeah,
I know that some of the key concepts that really stick out to me are, number one is complexity. I've found that more there's different kinds of complexity, but complexity of design is something I look for. How to convey age in the fine branch tips. I think both of those require a lot of two different things, both um, some level of technique, and it might not be a high technique or low technique, but it requires doing some specific thing, and then it requires time doing that specific thing over time. And so, ideally, I would be creating trees that would be able to hold the attention of people to think about it. We know whether or not they walk right by it and think, "Oh, that style's boring," whatever. That's totally fine. It's more like for someone that actually wants to look a little closer to think, "Oh, interesting. There are some decisions that went into that," and then people can make what they will of it.
nice.
Because essentially, when we view other people's trees, we, as bonsai practitioners, we try to reverse engineer it. Like,
Yeah.
how did they get the exposed roots to move that direction, or like, what was the action plan to get it there?
Yeah, especially for communities with less historical bonsai around. We're all desperate for starting points, and we're eager to then start taking the time when we find productive starting points and think, wow, okay, how am I going to bend these branches? Am I bending them up or down? Am I going to make them all squiggly or make them straight? Is it a quiet feeling tree or a bold, brash feeling? And then, but the reality is, we're taking the same trunks, and maybe one person will angle it down more than another. One person might carve it a little more than another. One person might make it more dense than the other. But then, what are they going to do for the next 10 to 30 years to really give that tree that unmistakable character that people around the world have found so compelling?
Yeah. Have you found, have you been to Australia before?
I have. I visited a handful of bonsai nurseries in Australia. When was that? Around 10, 12 years ago, something like that.
Oh, nice. And would you say on your travels around the world, do you see a definitive visual context on each continent, sort of in general? Like even within the US, I can see from when I've been there and Japan also, I can see almost from town to town sometimes different styles and approaches to trees. I mean, say the Abes in Japan being around the Fukushima area, it's just a stylistic. It's influenced probably by their mountains. Do you see that quite visually on your travels?
There's a couple different ways in which that shows up. I've not done a ton of the travel in person, so a lot of it's from images. But what I have noticed, I have traveled to many bonsai gardens in Japan and seen a lot of different approaches over there. Part of it is there are well, one of them is obviously you're going to see different species in different places based on weather. That's a given. And then different species may lend themselves to some techniques better than others. But, in a big place like the US, where there may be a lot of overlap among species throughout the country, it's more in terms of kind of less geography and more spheres of influence. In other words, who is your teacher or your spiritual north? In other words, how are you orienting your basic approach? The thing that cracks me up is that often it's the level of detail that changes from environment to environment. For instance, in Europe, I see far more detailed work in terms of cleaning deadwood, making the trees just absolutely sparkle, just way more hands-on detail work going in. And yes, that looks different in different countries across Europe, but it's kind of night and day to the US where you don't see that level of detail. When I think of your region and where broadleafs are so much more prevalent, it's really interesting. I'm more fascinated by the new species, and I immediately just start thinking, wow, what are you going to do with that over the next 10 or 20 years? It's because often when we're working with broadleafs, we have larger internodes and or larger leaves, or we have little tiny leaves that you can kind of do anything you want with. And so it's like, wow, what are our models going to be for these less um, less traveled species?
Yeah, it's very exciting for sure. It's very exciting down here in New Zealand. We have very unique, very unique flora, and we're experimenting with those species a lot, whether it's coastal or mountainous, montane. But it is very exciting. Species we don't see in the northern hemisphere.
I'll piggyback that excitement growing up in the United States and moving here 16, 17 years ago and learning all the native trees and being here for that long, still learning new ones all the time. Like Adrian recently turned me on to a pygmy pine, the world's smallest conifer. And he and I are both experiencing our little pygmy pines pushing lots of growth. And it's so exciting because there's nothing like it outside of New Zealand.
That's super cool. I know when I was in Australia, that was a good example of a lot of trees with which I'm not familiar. We actually grow a ton of Australian species in the States, just as part of the normal horticultural or ornamental horticulture business. But I just found myself really enjoying taking hikes through different forests, whether in the Blue Mountains here or some random coastal forest there, is just paying attention to what kind of characters these different species took on as they got giant, as they got old. And they're very, very different than I grew up hiking in the Sierra Nevada, where I'm used to alpine landscapes, which is, similar to what you might find in Europe. So it was really fun. And it's cool because there are no just obvious answers, at least for me, in terms of what direction to go, but a lot of really wonderful starting points.
And our South Island has the Southern Alps here, so there'll be a different iteration of some of those trees here because we have exotics like Scots pine and other conifers that are growing in the Alps in the South Island.
Yeah, it's almost like the upside down world. Bit of a Stranger Things reference there, but yeah, us being in the southern hemisphere, alpine, it's podocarps and beech forest. It is very different to northern hemisphere alpine in some respects. The elements that force are similar, but the species are just different. So the way that the character, I mean, obviously there's torturous, gnarly trunks, there's ton of deadwood, um, but the leaf characteristic or the needle characteristic, um, or even the volcanic that the substrate it's growing in, all these things combined with the species being podocarp, for instance, is very different visually.
And probably depending on the photocarpus you're working on, those things can take on, at least the ones that I've worked on, they can take on just about any form you give them, which always makes me wonder what is going to evoke an old or ancient version of the tree that a non-bonsai person that grew up in New Zealand would immediately recognize and say, oh, that reminds me of when I go hiking in that place.
Yeah, definitely. I find quite often as I'm teaching around our country and working with my clients throughout New Zealand on my travels, because I personally I'm into showing that ancient form, and so if I'm getting some type of podocarp, for instance, a New Zealand native, when I'm working on it, I'm trying to show that age, um, multiple iterations of a top being snapped out and reforming. So I find a lot of the clubs around New Zealand I'm working with, a lot of people may have only seen some of those species growing um, at sea level in a nice park where the trees just don't have that image. And so when I'm stylistically creating something, like you say, it can take on any form you like, really. Um, I find people going, oh, but that it doesn't look like that, but it's because they haven't potentially been up into the Alps or to the coast where these forms are being created. I'm really personally, like you say, I create art for myself, like you both do too, probably. But inevitably, if you're going to put something on display, what's the viewer going to think? And quite often the viewer thinks potentially of my trees like, I've never seen a totara grow like that, for example. I get it quite often. But I have in my area, I've seen many of those contorted, twisted forms.
No, it's a fun thing to think through. One thing I'd love to see more of is what these trees do in coastal regions, because in areas where you don't have, there's always different kinds of extremity. It doesn't always need to be altitude or harsh winters. It can also be windy coastline or just barren soils. And all of those can create some really interesting forms. And so to try to bring out these forms in a way that Japanese would not be, it would not be natural for the Japanese to come up with these forms. It's kind of fun to think, do we really have to transplant this form based on the way mountain trees grow or coastal conifers grow in Japan and apply it to all these other species? Or do we literally start looking out for these other forms and then kind of figuring it out on our own based on, what we can do with them?
It kind of goes back to what like grows well where you're growing. Like I'm in a coastal area that's really windy, so I even have young conifers that are like 4 years old that have flaky bark, and it's just because their trunks are bouncing around, and it's kind of fun to see young material with flaky bark already.
And that actually brings up another good point, which is there are lots and lots of species all over your country. They're not all necessarily good for bonsai. And I know that when people go off script, they think, well, why do I have to grow this given Juniperus chinensis? Because that's a Japanese tree. It's like, no, we don't grow it because it's Japanese. We grow it because it has fantastic characteristics for long-term life in a pot. And so I think the same thing is going to be true, whether it's for the podocarps or whatever it happens to be. Are there trees with particularly good characteristics for very long-term development? And it's going to take a little bit of time to suss that out.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, to be honest, because I have experimented personally with most natives and have arrived at, after 25 to 28 years, have arrived at species that I know are stable long term in the pot. And I know that some, while they look fantastic in the container, they potentially might only have that 15 to 20-year span before they exhaust themselves. Um, yeah, so, but I don't discourage people to not go down that road and experiment with those species because, I mean, it's you sort of zoom out and think, well, I had 15 great years with that tree and it was enjoyable, but I knew it was going to exhaust itself. Or, I tend to like things that are sustainable myself. So I wanted to know that it's going to go 50 to 100, maybe 200 years out in the container or on that rock, however you're going to display it. But yeah, I don't want to stop people from experimenting with these shorter lived species.
That's right. It's because you never want to throw, good after bad. That's what we're all trying to avoid. But on the other hand, I know, and I've been the same, is no one else has ever made this work, but maybe they're not watering it right. Maybe they're not fertilizing it right. Maybe they're not using the right soil. Maybe there's another technique. And so you try all of this experimentation, only to realize 10 years later, no, that's just a really dumb species to work with if your goals are to end up in this totally other place. But you've got to kind of encourage as much creativity as possible for the obvious reason that, look, it's a hobby. Let people have fun with it. And who knows what they're going to come up with, man. I love being surprised by bonsai. It's really fun to see something executed well that you just didn't see coming. Like that's just a treat.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. It's interesting to think, even experimenting with the display of a tree, I'm looking at more abstract forms of displaying things, um, sculpturally speaking, not necessarily in a quote unquote container on a top of a table, but I know a lot of people experiment with displaying in timber, for example, found pieces of deadwood or driftwood and treating that driftwood inevitably for 15, 20, maybe 30 years later for it to degrade and rot out, and that being part of the composition, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, that's not the road I'm going down. I think I would like it to last longer than that in terms of display. But yeah, that sort of brings in that whole idea of Is it part of your display for it to degrade like that, just like potentially a branch is going to get hit by a fungal problem and die back? And that's going to be deadwood, and that's part of the journey per se.
Yeah, and that's a really fun one too, because more and more I'm open to, you know what, we're going to enjoy this gin for 5 years, and after that, we're going to enjoy some other feature, because the reality is, things break, things rot, things fall off, and or we change our mind stylistically. And so more and more I'm open to when someone tells me, hey, like I want to do this really short-term thing, and it's like, cool, go for it. It gives us something other than just a static image of this is the final tree. It will look like this going forward. And I kind of appreciate that. But you've also mentioned display, and Eric Schrader made a really fantastic comment on this topic, which is when you're putting together a display and you're using something other than, tree, table, pot, he said, while it's really easy and sometimes fun to put all kinds of other things in a display, he wants to make sure that if you bring in something else, that an expert of that something else finds it excellent. Because if I've been studying bonsai for 30 years and I've made a lot of conscious decisions over decades that go into the presentation of a tree, if I try to build my first stand, it's probably not going to impress a woodworker. If I hire a metal worker to do one random project, depending on the level of skill of that craftsperson, it could be an interesting idea, but it's like, how do you pay the same kind of respect for every item in a display that we give to the trees? It's an interesting idea. I really like that.
It is, yeah, yeah. Very good point, because I have noticed when I've judged some shows here in New Zealand and on my travels, seen different displays where someone goes out of the box in terms of display in a show or an exhibition. It often misses the mark for me. Uh, I guess craftsmanship, but also sometimes going out of the box to show the artist is trying to make a statement. It's too in your face, I think, often. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, regarding what they're trying to say. Sometimes they've gone abstract and they're trying to maybe make a point of going abstract, but it doesn't pull in with the tree, where the tree's from, et cetera, et cetera. It's a little bit, I guess, over the top. Um, I have found in modern contemporary display. I'm trying to, yeah, go ahead, Scott.
I've got a question for both of you. Are there any non-traditional elements that you'd like to incorporate into your bonsai designs? Examples, atypical tables, atypical pots, or other mechanisms?
The short answer is yes.
For me too, yes, definitely. It's aesthetically dialing that in for me is the challenge, which I really love. Coming from art school, and I want to push that idea of a contemporary display, but for me, it has to tie in aesthetically with the tree. The tree still has to be, for me, the visual reference point. Everything else has to support that without taking away from it, but also challenging the viewer, I think. Sculpture.
Yeah. And so coming from an art school background, I'm always thinking the idea of naive art. And so as soon as you go off script, yes, you're totally free to do whatever you want, but you don't necessarily want to come off as a really half-baked idea. And so I think while there's a lot to celebrate in naive art, there's a lot of it that, the snobs might look down on. And so I just think, where's that magic blend of novelty in idea with a high enough level of execution? And for bonsai, I think actually the most heartening attempts in these directions haven't necessarily been incredibly complicated, but they've just involved natural objects that are really interesting. Or there's a really neat display in Chicago earlier this year. It was a scrap of wood that an architect found on a job site, and it had a couple spots in it in which he could plant a bonsai or an accent coming out the corner. And I thought, man, that is such a crafty use of this fun material that just inherently has great character. And so I really like being able to take advantage of stuff like that. I do not believe that all bonsai can be exclusively displayed on top of a table on top of a table. Like the tree on table is just seems like one of a lot of ways to display bonsai. I like it, but it's just hard to tell people with a straight face, if you're serious, you need to buy a lot of tables that you only use once a year.
Yeah, yeah. That ties in with the economy too, in the area that you're in, any given area, and whether there's those high quality woodworkers or the someone has the expense to bring something in from Japan, you know.
Yeah, it's really fun. Do you have you all had success fostering a community of craftspeople who can make stands? I know you've got a lot of potters in New Zealand.
Yeah, we're getting there, and with woodworkers too. It's we still have to build that up more for sure.
We have Den Becker Woodworks out of Auckland that's been building stands and slabs for people that have been displaying at various shows throughout New Zealand. And he's still exploring new designs with his clients, and you can definitely see some refinement in his work already. But just off the top of my head, we just have one woodworker that's consistently wanting to build for us.
You'll see when you come over actually next year for the national show. Are you excited about that?
Very. I haven't been to New Zealand, so I mean, it just sounds absolutely wonderful.
Only 298 days.
All right.
The countdown's on. How long will you be spending in New Zealand?
It's 2 weeks of bonsai program, and I'm trying to convince my partner to come over, and so she and I can spend at least a week of vacation on top of that.
Cool.
Yeah, if you can, try and get down to the South Island if you can.
Yeah, I definitely would love to do that. So many great things to see. Even if it's just like whether we're hiking in nature or, I mean, I guess that's kind of the highlight. We're happy to hike all over the place. So to see some of the mountains, to see some of those beautiful coastal areas, there's no lack of places I'd love to visit.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
It's nice too, Jonas, 'cause your dollar will go a lot further here.
Unless things swiftly change.
Yeah, these days we never know, but yeah, really looking forward to it. Just I know that there's a really enthusiastic community down there, and so that's it's just exciting. I have found that, as you all have, I'm sure, that the bonsai people are just good folks wherever you go, and it's fun to be able to share enjoyment and appreciation for something as funny as little plants and containers, and to find it so rich and fulfilling and able to connect you to so many people with similar kinds of feelings.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it?
I'm really grateful for when I got to go to the first Pacific Bonsai Expo, because I didn't know a lot of that community, but they were really open and friendly, and we already had a lot in common. So it was really exciting, and I was grateful for that experience.
It was so great to have you. I mean, every time I saw you walking around with a smile on your face, that was just another reminder, hey, this is great.
Yeah, that was mind-blowing for me in a great way.
Good. Yeah, we're just now kicking off our next event, which will be in February of 27. And due to foolish optimism, I'm really enthusiastic about it. I'm very excited. I'm just dying to know what the show's going to look like.
The venue is really big, so that'll give you a lot of opportunities to play with the environment.
Yes, the big trade-off we made is we've got a really great space and a lot of size and good light to work with. It'll be our first event that's not built around natural light, and so we're already thinking, what are some creative ways to really make the trees shine?
Oh, lighting, yeah. That'll be the big challenge, won't it?
It's always a big challenge, but it's kind of the thing that has set the show apart, which is the show's so prominently featured natural light. And so we're already thinking about how do we orient things, how are we working with the sun, and if we're working primarily with artificial light, how can we make that work to our advantage?
Is it to my understanding, Jonas, that there'll be multiple buildings hosting that show?
Yeah, what it is it'll be kind of 3 buildings total. So the main building will be essentially half vendors and half exhibit. And then a second building will be hosting a variety of programs. And the third building we're getting for one day just to have a banquet. So we'll have a Friday night reception for exhibitors and sponsors and donors. And then we have the show Saturday. Saturday night, we'll have a banquet that anyone would like can come to that. And then all day Saturday and Sunday, we have a couple of completely insane ideas up our sleeves, but it's looking like we'll do some talks, demos, panels, and what might end up being a fairly mental competition.
Oh, really? Panel discussions, I think, are fantastic. So you're thinking of having some panel discussions with multiple artists on stage fielding questions. Is that correct?
That's right. And so we did a little bit of that last time. We want to do that again. I'm a big fan of identifying opportunities that only exist at events like this. And so I'm a big fan of beautiful trees displayed well, where just all of the effort has been given to the branches, to the container, to the top dressing, to the display. And so I want there to be as much teaching as possible just to help people at all levels, or even non-bonsai people, really understand and appreciate the energy that's gone into the trees. And then I like the idea of panels because it's an opportunity for people to interact with professionals, with craftspeople. We did a potter's session, a grower's session. We had a session with potters from Japan actually last time, and so just so great. People love hearing about how high performers do what it is they do, and it can be really educational as well.
Yeah, for sure. So when you say a growers section, was that around potentially like field growing? That,
Exactly.
yeah.
And so we had 3 prominent growers up on stage together, each giving a little brief talk with some kind of tips, and then just lots of questions from the audience, because the US, like New Zealand, just we don't have tons and tons of material. And I'm sure it's an even bigger struggle where you are, I'd imagine. But
It is.
it's always a struggle. Like the demand for material is not going to be met any time within my lifetime, I don't believe. And so the more we can share kind of techniques and approaches for creating our own material, the sooner we'll be able to make larger, more compelling shows.
For sure. Have you found that with the field growing operations, in especially your area of the US, is there a swing towards field growing more native, or is it still largely Japanese sort of traditional species for the field growing crowd?
You know, it feels like there's kind of a new generation of growers right now, and they are all growing a handful of standbys and a handful of odds and ends. And they're finding out what nursery people have always known. It is incredibly hard to grow large quantities of high quality products. And so it feels like we're in the stage of people dialing in what species, styles, and sizes are the most productive given their expertise, their interest, their climates, their location. And we're producing some great 3, 4, 5-year-old trees right now. And so I think over the next 5 years, hopefully we'll start seeing some super compelling 8, 9, 10-year-old material.
Very cool.
Yeah, I to balance up as a full-time bonsai artist myself, I've had to do field growing for many years too, to have stock to sell trees to keep going, because working on bonsai collections around New Zealand and having clients is one part of it, but also I have to field grow stocks, create trees for sale too.
Uh-huh.
So I've always lent on the Japanese black pine and trident maple, Japanese maples. Um, I guess as a bread and butter stock, yeah, but also done quite a lot of natives too, but not on a big enough scale, on a large enough quantity to meet the demand currently for how we're pushing our natives. So I'm getting a lot of people wanting natives from me now, that I should have field grown 15 years ago. So we had some fantastic 15-year-old stock of the natives, but sort of 15, 16 years ago when I first started the field growing, I just got some Japanese black pine seed in from Japan and lent on those because I knew they'd sell, and they did. They sold really well. But I'm playing catch up on our natives now. It's fantastic that we are getting the demand through for these podocarps, our natives. I've just got to really get them humming. But that's interesting that it's probably a similar thing in the US.
Yeah, I think all of us are in the same boat when we don't have generations of growers preceding us, and that we're all figuring it out, which I think is really fun because, being friends with the growers, you can find whole batches of things which are good for workshops and for people, that are testing out their techniques or trying out new design directions. I always think that's a piece of the puzzle. Collected material is fantastic. I love it, but I don't think everything needs to be that, because such a key aspect of bonsai is the relationship between people and the trees. I don't think of us as just miniaturists.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I find that having field grown for a while now, uh, it's quite satisfying to field grow material, and I guess you put your sort of we try to keep the field grown, say a Japanese black pine, fairly standard, so that the buyer can put their stylistic ideas into it themselves. But it's
Nice.
quite nice to see trees that you've grown, say field grown for 10 years, they've gone off and you see those trees 15 years later. So they might be 15 to 16 years old. And you can see the field grown touch, which would have probably come from our field. And then one or two artists that have come through and touched those trees. And it's quite noticeable to me, actually, as
That's
more
nice.
hands touch the tree, even in that small time frame of, say, 15 years, 12 to 15 years. Yeah, it's enjoyable, which you're not going to get from some collected material from the mountains or the coast necessarily, where it's all set there, fantastic trunk, deadwood, and you're framing that up, and then the artist will do what they will with that. But yeah, like you mentioned, it's quite nice and important to see trees starting from scratch. That's why your blog has been so fantastic, and I direct people to it all the time. uh, your blog, you can go there and you can see from seedling to relatively mature material, all the steps all the way, which I think is fantastic. That's why I'm really rapt that you're coming over next year.
Oh, thanks. If I ever get tricked into writing a third book, I've already kind of decided it'll be long-term case studies, because people do love seeing that. That's definitely what they're asking for.
Yeah, it's inspiring for sure, especially specifically for people first getting into it, because I found that a lot of people first getting into the art form, they are very passionate about starting something from seed.
So that's a relatively new thing. And I don't know, I think it's partly generational and partly epochal. In other words, it feels like a lot of people who started in the last 5 years, and a large number of really young folks, they want to do the trees kind of soup to nuts from scratch. And it's almost like it's not the goal isn't to make a good tree. The goal is to create something that reflects their input into it, which didn't occur to me the first 20 years I was in bonsai. I just wanted to be able to create the best trees possible. I saw images at first of really amazing trees, and I thought, ooh, that's interesting. Then I got the chance to go to Japan, see them in person, and I thought, yeah, these are interesting. And it didn't even occur to me whether I made a tree, whether it was a collected tree or whatever it happened to be. I just wanted to have really interesting, beautiful objects in my garden, wherever they came from. At the same time, I've been growing trees from scratch for over 30 years. And so I do love that process, but I'm
Yeah,
currently only growing, or at least aiming to grow, very small batches of higher quality small trees, because I'm realizing the time involved and the space required to make quality trees is limiting. And so I'm going to let the growers that have the time and the space go for the big stuff. And I'm just going to do small, cute little batches so I can keep teaching and learning and just experiencing the joy of working with trees at all stages of development.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I came from a similar sort of idea where when I was younger, I just used to like looking at kokofu books and just
Yeah.
studying those forms of those generally larger trees. I was obsessed with just that, to bring up what Scott mentioned, reverse engineering um, those kokofu trees, and we're not really allowed to collect unless we've got certain areas where you get explicit permission. We can't just pull natives anywhere from New Zealand. We have to have permission. A lot of areas
Mhm.
we can't collect. So I've always grown from scratch from an, I guess, earlier ages. So produced trees from seed or cutting. Obviously, I do have collected material too, or trees that have come from other, as called legacy trees. But I've always enjoyed starting from scratch and trying to create the most ancient looking form I could from a cutting or seedling onwards. I mean, it does, the longer you've got, the better, obviously. But
That's cool.
yeah, get in there early, yeah. Well, it's funny actually because someone the other day was saying, "Oh, I'm 86 and I feel it's too late for me to start bonsai." But I had a small bonsai and plant shop in Auckland City here in New Zealand, and an elderly bunch of people came in, and it was this lady's birthday, and she'd just turned 85. And her friends, she said, "Oh, I've always wanted to start bonsai." She was looking at some of them we had in the shop. And I said, "Oh, it's never too late to start." And her friends all laughed at me and laughed at her. And I said, "No, look, you start off with some of this material. Within 5 years, before you're 90, you'll have a great collection of bonsai." And all her friends laughed, but she went with that, and she built up a collection from me over 5 years. She's got about 12 trees now. She's 92, 93.
Wow.
And she's got a fantastic Shohin collection of reasonably high quality trees. She came in just before I closed my physical shop and moved up to where I am now with my bonsai garden here. As I closed that shop, a couple of weeks beforehand, she came in with her friends, and her friends were just like, "Oh, she just loves her trees, and you just proved us wrong." 5 years later, we just adore her little trees. She has them all on her balcony at her retirement home, and they're fantastic. So it's never too late to start, is where I'm going with that rant.
See, that's a great story. Whenever people tell me they're not interested, and I just say to them, "Oh, are you planning on quitting bonsai in 5 years?"
Yeah.
And that always stops people in their tracks. They never like to hear that, but it's like I never expect to see a finished tree when I start something. It's just not about that. The reason I like growing trees at different stages is honestly, it's fun to do the work at different stages. It requires different kinds of creativity and different techniques, and it's a unique set of challenges that I find just really fun to face.
Yeah, me too. It's as cheesy as it is to say, it's the journey, not the destination, as with life.
Yeah.
Hey, Scott, do you want to hear about the crazy ideas we have for the competition for the next expo?
I'm all ears.
So, what if so do you have competitions down in New Zealand?
We do.
And how do they normally, what's the format typically?
I've went through scoring a show, well, two different shows, just by myself, not with multiple judges, and just scoring like the trunk, primary branches, taper, the apex, the relationship with the pot, the total composition, and just did like a point system. But I think it varies from score slash judger to judge.
Uh,
Yeah, and in terms of the layout for the shows, fairly standard, rows of tables with the monotone backdrop, and table on table tree buzz.
Neat. And so we're thinking of, at least for scoring the show itself proper, that's going to be pretty similar to what we've done in the past. We'll make little tweaks, but there are a lot of new talent competitions in the US where they hand a bunch of contestants, maybe half a dozen people, a conifer, and they do a rough styling in one day, and then the headliners come in and judge who did the best job. Do you do those kinds of events?
We do, yeah.
And is that kind of the basic format you follow for that?
It is.
And so what we were thinking is, I've never been really a fan of that because I thought, the material's usually so, and having beginner to beginner intermediate people work under stressful conditions on suboptimal material delivers very predictable results. And so what was interesting is there was a statewide organization in California sponsored an event, and they wanted it to be a little more intermediate level. So they found a group of people with more experience, and they all took it as a personal challenge or an opportunity to learn. People created study programs. They consciously built up their skills. They worked on practice material. They self-organized and did a podcast with every last contestant talking about what it meant to them to compete and what they were getting out of it. And I thought, this is more something that interests me. They're using a competition for personal improvement and for educational ends, and then they're getting camaraderie on, as a bonus on top of it. So I thought, we never like doing things the normal way for the expo. So what would be the expo take on a competition? And I thought, what if we did, instead of just an all-day conifer styling, what if we did more of a heptathlon? Say we had 7 totally different events, and that the participants would have to demonstrate a much broader variety of skills over the course of a day to then allow us to identify who is this well-rounded person who was able to complete a wider variety of tasks well, instead of just one, or instead of just hoping you get the better tree.
Multi-layered.
Yeah. And so I kind of don't even want to give away the exact competition ideas, but we will definitely, if we can find someone to help us run this, it'll be a ton of work. Identify the categories. We'll have a display category, maybe a show prep category, maybe a wiring, maybe a styling, maybe something involving repotting. But can you imagine how fun it'd be to send someone into a room with 3 small trees, 4 medium trees, a half dozen accents, and a few stands, and say, here, create a meaningful display that tells a story, and then write us what that story would be.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I think an important part of those beginner competitions too is the critique after the fact is very important. I've found when you go around and actually talk about what the students have created. Obviously, you'll probably have that included, but I've found they learn a lot from that.
That's right. You hit the nail on the head of this whole approach, which is we'll probably want to hire at least one videographer and photographer to follow them all day long, because the number of educational assets that we could create would be incredible. Because I would want a different professional to judge every aspect or every category of the competition, and that feedback they provide could potentially help the competitor, the artist, as well as, since we'll be publishing this, anyone who wants to enjoy the media after the fact.
Yeah, definitely. Great, fantastic idea. That's very exciting, isn't it?
It is. And actually, just very specifically following what you had said, one of our main goals as event organizers has been trying to figure out ways to really put the spotlight on the exhibitor community, because it's the people that go to all of this extraordinary effort to make these beautiful trees. We want them to benefit as much as possible from the event. And I think we are going to figure out a way to provide feedback from multiple professionals for every single tree in the room, so that as an exhibitor, you will be able to take away, and again, we can put this all on YouTube, for instance, say minimum two video critiques of every tree in the room.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, that sort of brings me into another question. Have you found that, for me personally, I look at an exhibition, I just want to see the absolute best trees on display. I don't mind where they come from, who worked on them, who owns them. Have you found that in the US, to to say thank you to those people putting that effort in to put the best tree into a show, which requires a lot of time, effort, and resource? Do you find that more people are more likely to enter a fantastic tree if it's judged, there's awards, or there's a monetary aspect to it?
There's a lot one can say about that topic.
Yeah. Probably shouldn't have opened that can of worms.
I'll go through it really quickly. For the expo specifically, we have found that money is not a motivator for the awards. And when we approached our sponsors and said, would you rather the money, we actually asked the sponsors and the prize winners, and we said, would you rather the money go towards strengthening the event, or would you rather the money essentially get returned to the competitors? And unanimously, and not that we asked all of them, but everyone said they would much, much rather strengthen the success of the show over time. And so we actually kept the sponsorships the same from one year after the next, but instead of offering cash awards, they just became donations, and the winners got bragging rights, and that's something we're happy to support them in that race.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
But in terms of getting material, two things come from that, which is as soon as you have awards, some people don't like participating. In California, our statewide exhibition used to not have awards for decades. And when they actually first introduced it, they had two shows for a while, an unjudged room and a little teeny tiny room where trees could be judged. It's just for historical reasons, people thought, how can someone else judge one's art? And well, we can show you how a lot of different art forms do this.
Yeah.
And now the big question is, do professionals show their trees along with the amateurs, and or do the professionals want to enter trees that could potentially be competitive, or are they just participating for fun but not wanting to take away prize opportunities from customers? And you can kind of guess all of the potential conflicts within that whole topic.
Yeah. We're having a similar issues here in New Zealand, I think, with shows whereby I think some of the rules that have been instigated, for instance, a national show, I think I might not be accurate here, but it's something like you had to have been the only one who'd physically worked on that tree uh, for 3 or 4, maybe 5 years before entering the show. So you couldn't have had someone else work on the tree before it gets accepted into a national show, which kind of leaves out someone like myself, a professional who travels the country and works on a lot of collections and some, what I'd say, quite class material couldn't be entered in these national shows because I might have worked on it or another professional. So I think we're going through a similar scenario here in New Zealand, maybe even in Australia, not too sure, where it's do professionals enter trees in these shows, or because for me personally, I really do not care who touched the tree at any stage, whether it was the day before, 10 years before. I just want to see the best trees on display and take the owner out of the equation essentially, and it's just about the tree.
We are so on the same page about that. And that was actually one of the key founding principles of the expo is it's about the tree, it's about the tree, it's about the tree. In fact, we're so liberal in that I actually entered a tree in the exhibit, sold it during the year, and then it had a new owner by the time the show came around. We showed it under that person's name. The tree actually won an award, and to me, that is working perfectly.
Yeah.
When you look at what is incentivized when you create rules like that, is you're incentivizing different kinds of behavior, and you're essentially discouraging people from working with professionals, which at some level is going out of it. It's creating a system that goes out of its way to reward less sophisticated work. And what they're saying is it's more about the owner than it is about the tree. And it doesn't mean there's not room for that, but it's kind of funny when you think backwards. Why is it that it's more important to think about the worker than it is the product?
Yeah, totally. Say in Japan, if someone like Kimura works on a tree, obviously, and it gets into Kokufu, and then that wins an award, the professional gets to celebrate having worked on that tree. The owner gets to celebrate because it's their sort of tree too. So I see where they both get to have some acknowledgement there, but that doesn't seem to ring true here in New Zealand currently. Yeah.
Well, you can maybe answer that question for me. And so in Japan, professionals are smart. They would never enter a tree in which they would be competing with a customer because the customer is king over there. And so the idea is that every show we've ever heard of, with one exception, is no professionals enter in those. It's really just about the customers. And then there's the Sakufu, which is the Maker's Award, and that's professionals only. That makes sense, pure division. Europe is totally different, where in Europe, you essentially can't be a successful professional without winning an award. Now, that's not exactly true, but the US is kind of right in the middle, where some professionals really want to win awards, other professionals really don't want to win awards. And so it's this interesting mix. I'm kind of curious where you see New Zealand in that.
I would say we're sitting where you are, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. We're slightly behind, I would say, the US because of sheer numbers and experience and amount of professionals, to be honest. You've got a lot of artists that have come back from Japan in recent times in the US, which is fantastic for the US.
Yeah.
And also people that have never left the US that are fantastic too. But I think we fit into that gap at the moment where we're just trying to figure out if someone's got a beautiful tree, but a professional has worked on it the day before and it goes into a show and wins. Yeah, I think where we are with you guys as well. Yeah.
It's funny. It's not concerning. I think it'll all work itself out. And at some level, the show is for the people, not the trees. It's just funny that these things come up and create friction, or they don't incentivize the kind of behavior the organizers might want. When we actually kicked off the first expo, we thought, we don't know what awards to offer. Let's let people put some money behind their beliefs and let them sponsor their own awards. And we essentially received multiple versions of the same request. And that was, do you have a sort of award that recognizes someone who's never been to a regional exhibit, or someone who only started a few years ago? Or they were all these, it's a good tree, except, and
Yeah.
we ended up saying no to all of those awards, because in all of those cases, the judges weren't picking the best award based on the tree alone. It was picking an award based on some category of the owner. And so we ended up not going with any special prizes that first year. We're actually still open to doing that. And we've talked with a few people about some potential ways to recognize different communities. One thing that's come out is, as you know, and knowing nothing about New Zealand bonsai, I can guarantee this is real for you all. Different people studying with different teachers may have very different artistic goals. And if your group is in the minority, the odds of winning an award at a big show are much, much lower. And I think of that as an interesting situation. And so I've been thinking a lot about what ways there might be to navigate that and to provide ways for different sized communities to celebrate excellence.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot too of recent times. I think here in New Zealand, it's still such a young art that when exhibitions are put on, the organisers really want to encourage celebrating people getting into the art and showing what's achievable for a beginner and also a mid-level artist, to show that, I guess, that growth, which is important for sure. And I think that ties into all of the previous things we've been talking about, that maybe the US has already dealt with maybe 15 or 20 years ago. We're dealing with now, yeah, potentially. So they're trying to show, for instance, there's the Hamilton Bonsai Club here in New Zealand puts on a fantastic regular show once a year, and they have a beginners section and now an intermediate section, and then a more mature section. So I guess that's valuable.
And I think that's actually kind of cool when you kind of separate that out. I recommend to a lot of clubs Some clubs do a great job with their beginner sections. Some of the trees may be in terracotta or even plastic containers, but they found some really artful ways to arrange those trees. And I think that's a way to let every last person participate, and it normalizes exhibiting trees. And I think that's the important thing. If you just make sure the trees are healthy, well prepared, it doesn't matter what the level is or whether or not it's truly humble material. As long as it's presented respectfully, I think it can really add a lot to shows, because non-bonsai people don't know one from another much of the time. And so let everyone participate and give them something to work toward down the road.
Yeah, they learn a lot too. So much from exhibiting at any
Yeah.
level. What I've found that I've really enjoyed is when I've judging the intermediate level trees that I see coming through, design wise, the structure, the layout, I've found is of oftentimes higher quality, or at the same level as the more mature trees in the mature areas. So you can see that the intermediate level folk are coming up under that wing, and you can already see in 10, 20 years' time, that intermediate level tree is going to be potentially a lot better than some of the mature stuff that's come through. I always find that exciting.
Oh, that's super satisfying when you see that.
Yeah, the laying out of the structure and just dialing in aesthetic choices for, for species and display too. It's really nice to see the intermediate level. They're striving for a high quality result.
That's fantastic. So actually, on all of these notes, what is what can I best help with? So I'll be coming into the country knowing less than anyone in the room about literally the names of the species in front of me, let alone the techniques for them. And so what do you think might be a helpful perspective for your community that someone from abroad can bring?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, what I can do is send you a list of some of our staple natives
Hmm.
to help along the way, and some images of of those in the wild. But it's likely you'll be seeing a lot of the higher quality, more mature specimens in the show being uh, pines, I would say, classic Japanese varieties,
Hmm.
because we are still pushing our natives hard. There'll be a few nice ones hopefully on display, and so they'll be interesting species for you. But your best bet would be, I always talk about yourself and your blog, that the broad range from your blog of starting from scratch right through to sort of
Refined.
semi-mature material. Um, I really see your skill set is just so stand out there. So when you come over and you're critiquing or looking at the material, I think naturally you're just going to bring something different anyway from your perspective, regardless of the species and how that species might or might not look here in New Zealand. Um, that doesn't really help, does it? I didn't really answer your question, but
That sounds absolutely fantastic. That sounds right in line with what I've been imagining. So I think that sounds great.
And Jonas, I think a lot of trees here that you are familiar with, as we have a lot of American exotics here, various maples, Japanese maples, junipers of various kinds, and lots of different kinds of pine that have come from the United States. So you'll definitely have your wheelhouse and opportunity to share with us with what we have here too.
Great. I'm really looking forward to it. I think it'll be really fun.
yeah, no, we can't wait to have you. Can't wait to have you. Very exciting. Oh well, I guess that probably wraps it up for us here. I've got to get out and water my trees because it's very hot. How about you, Scott? You all good
Um,
there?
yeah, I'll leave here and go home and water as well too.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time because I know we all got to get our hands on trees and life and whatnot. So I just want to say thank you so much for chatting with us.
Oh, it's fantastic. I'm so glad we finally got a chance to meet and to catch up today. And Scott, always good to hear your voice. I look
Good to hear it too.
forward to seeing you all in person before too long.
Yeah.
298 days.
All right.